Welcome. Today is this is our Relax into Health, Wealth, and Happiness meeting. So I hope that you're ready for some relaxation and some health and some wealth and some happiness, because that is the theme of the meeting. And it's true. And today I'm happy that you're here. I would like to explore something that I think will be quite interesting and valuable. I suppose that's always true, but some days I feel more. It feels more truthful to me than other days, and today it feels particularly true. So we'll see if it pans out. But I think it will be very nice. So the theme that I'd like to explore today, and and I'm going to tell you what the theme is up front, because otherwise maybe it won't be clear, which um, it tells you something about my level of confidence in my ability to express something. But what I mean is, I think I'll probably go about it in a somewhat roundabout way. And so I want to maybe give there's a word for this. This, I'm not sure what I want to give some kind of summary in advance so that we can all know what to look for. Like we're on a bit of an adventure. It'll be like a treasure hunt. And so now you'll know, once I state what it is, you'll know what to look for as we go along in our journey. So here's what I'd like to look at. That in this life we experience challenge, and this challenge can be experienced as quite difficult, even sometimes excruciating, with doubt and pain, not just physical pain, of course, physical pain, but pain at all levels because of lack of certainty about our direction and our what actions we're taking and the righteousness of all of it. And so do we have clues for how it is that we can approach our life, how we can approach these challenges that will be helpful? So that's the theme. Well, that wasn't even very clear. Even that much wasn't very clear. But that's the theme. And I'd like to look at it through the lens, partially through the lens of the Mahabharata, because as I've mentioned, I've been reading the unabridged, the 10-volume English translation of the critical edition, and it's continuing to be very impactful, which I suppose is not a big surprise, considering that it's some people call it the greatest story ever told. Now I know that some people call other stories the greatest story ever told, but some people do call this the greatest story ever told, and I can understand why, because it really is profoundly impactful, at least for me. So in order to now, it's also, as I've mentioned before, it's also the longest story. It's 10 volumes, and it details every single arrow shot in a war that kills somewhere between several million and a billion people. So that's a lot of arrows. So I clearly can't go into every arrow shot in the next 53 minutes, and you should be grateful that I won't. But I should give you some sort of some sort of synopsis of some of the key highlights or details of the story, so that what I'd like to present within that context will make sense to you. So, so the general context of this story is creation. And so we have to kind of go back, if as it were, to prior to creation. So if we could imagine such a thing, which we can't, but we could attempt to imagine, we could start to approach imagining such a thing as prior to creation. And what we end up with there is that it's sort of like it's both empty and full. So there's nothing there, but there's a complete totality of potential, but nothing actually exists. And so how on earth do we even begin to talk about that? And we have many names that are given to this, depending on the tradition and the time and the place and the people speaking about it. But one of these names is Shiva. And so we have Shiva. And within Shiva, there is a desire that arises. And this desire gives rise to all of creation. And in some accounts, this, you could say, begins perhaps with the creation of the soul. And this is called by some Vishnu. And Vishnu is personified as being afloat an ocean of milk resting on a cosmic serpent. And he sleeps for vast stretches of time. I mean, inconceivably long stretches of time. And as he sleeps, he dreams, and all of this is Vishnu's dream. Now, in terms of how this creation actually comes to be, apart from the fact that it's Vishnu's dream, there's also this bit about from his navel, as he's there sleeping, from his navel's this lotus sprouts. And in the lotus is this fellow named Brahma. And Brahma is sometimes referred to as the grandfather, because he is the one who creates all of this from his own self. And so he starts by creating some sons, meaning children who are male, from himself, and he creates 7 of them. And they're all tasked with creating everything. So they get set to this task of creating everything, and they determine this. Well, there's one guy, one of them named Marichi. He has a son himself named Kashyapa, and everybody looks at Kashyapa and they say, boy, this guy is really handsome and intelligent and virtuous, and he's the sort of guy who should father a lot of beings. And then they say, oh, but there's only one problem, is in order for him to do that, he's going to need, there need to be some women involved, but there are no women that could be his wives. And so they go to Brahma, and Brahma says, no problem. And he, from his right thumb, he creates somebody, a man named Daksha. And from his left thumb, he creates a woman whose name is, if I can get this straight, it's Ashinkni. So Daksha and Ashinkni. You're not going to be tested on this after the fact, so you don't have to care or memorize, but those are their names. And he says, you two, you should get together and have lots of daughters. And they say, that sounds great to us. So they have lots of daughters. They have 60 of them. And now they say, well, now they've grown up and it's time for them to get married. And they say, but we don't have that many men for them to get married to, 60 of them. How are we going to marry them off to? And they say, here's what we'll do. Each man can have multiple wives. And this fellow Kashyapa, because he should father many beings, we'll give him 13 of them for his wives. So he gets married to 13 of them. And they all want to have children straight away. So they start having children. And so he starts first, let's say the first children. He's got this one of his wives. They're all sisters, remember? One of his wives is named Diti, and one of them is Aditi. Another one of the, I'm not going to tell you all of their names. Another one is called Danu. And another one of them is called Vinata. And another one of them is called Cardu, I think, or something like that. Doesn't really matter. Let's not really care about most of them. Let's just care about three of them, actually. So Diti and Aditi and Danu. So Diti wants to have children, and she has lots, and she says, I want my children to be very strong. And so she has lots of strong children. The only problem is they are very strong, but they're a bit wicked, most of them. They're greedy and impatient, and they lie and they steal and they cheat. They're not necessarily evil, but they're just sort of wicked. They're, self-interested, don't really care about anybody else. And might makes right with the children of Diti, for the most part. There are some exceptions, but she's got a lot of them, and most of them are fairly wicked. Then Danu, so she wants to have lots of energetic children, and she does have lots of energetic children, and some of them set themselves to good tasks, and they're involved with the weather and things like that. But others of them, they fall in with the children of Diti, and they also become a bit wicked. So now you've got a whole bunch of these wicked children. Some who have applied themselves in good ways, and then we've got Aditi, and Aditi wants to have children who are virtuous. Whew, thank goodness. So finally, there's some virtuous children. She has 33 of them. And they are very virtuous, and that doesn't mean they're perfect, because they're certainly not. They're somewhat like you and me in many respects, so they sometimes lie, and they sometimes cheat, and they sometimes steal, and so forth. But by and large, they're fairly upright, decent, good, and so forth, honest. And so everybody looks at them and say, these 33, they're quite good and virtuous and upright. So we really need some people who will help monitor and manage and take care of everything in this creation. And conveniently, we've got these sort of three domains that we really need people to be in charge of: the stars, the sky, and the earth. So we'll just divide them up evenly, even Steven, 11, 11, and 11. And these become what we would call the devas, or the gods. Now, these wicked children of Diti and Danu, as a category together, they become known as the Asuras. So we've got the Devas and the Asuras. Now, the Asuras, they say, this is not fair that the Devas have been assigned to all these domains, and everybody seems rather enamored of them and thinks they're so great and wonderful and everything. What about us? Look at how strong we are. We can do anything. We can tear stuff up. Look at how great we are. We can beat things up. Look how great we are. And, it's not right. People should love us more than they love those stupid, terrible devas. And so there's enmity there. The Asuras never really can stand these devas, because I think the devas are a bit goody two-shoes, and it's not fair. And so they're always sort of looking for ways that they can harm the devas. Now, as time goes by and many things happen. Now, the thing about the devas and the Asuras is that they have the ability to take human births. And so they sometimes do this. And the Asuras, at a certain point, they really get into this kick of taking human births. They say, you know what, we could just dominate the earth. We'll just sort of take all of these human births and we'll dominate. And that will be great. And nobody can stop us. And sure enough, nobody can really stop them, because they are stronger. And so when they really set themselves to it, they can do whatever they want. So they take over. And the earth herself is distressed at this, because there's so many of them, and they're just really wreaking havoc, and she doesn't like it. And so she finally goes to Brahma and she says, Brahma, I'm really having a difficult time with all of these Asuras who've taken birth on the earth, and they're just making a mess of it. It's really terrible. And is there anything you could do? And Brahma says, sure, I'll set that straight. So Brahma says, here's what we're going to do, everybody. He says, Devas, you are going to take human birth, and you're going to help to oust the Asuras, because the Asuras are really causing a lot of problems. So that's what we're going to do. And the Devas say, well, this sounds good. And we're happy to do that and all. But there is only one problem, which is that actually the Asuras are stronger than we are. So, and there are many more of them. And so how are we going to do this? And Brahma says, no problem. We're going to have Vishnu also incarnate. So Vishnu, who is supreme, who's more powerful than everybody combined, will also take birth, and you'll all work together and you'll take care of this. So, so this is the backdrop for the Mahabharata. So now we've got this cast of characters who've taken their Asuras and Devas who've taken birth as humans. Now, they don't know this necessarily, or they sometimes know, but they often forget. Maybe a bit like you and me. Like sometimes we know of our divine nature and sometimes we forget. Maybe we forget more often than we remember. And so this cast of characters, they've taken birth, and they're all in this, well, some of the main characters are part of this lunar dynasty. They're as a group, they're, well, we'll call them the lunar dynasty. And it gets a bit complicated how to refer to them, but to keep things simple, I'll call some of them the Kurus and some of them the Pandavas. Okay, so the Kurus and the Pandavas, we could call them half brothers. You could call them cousins. They're somewhere between half brothers and cousins. Okay, and the Kurus are headed by this guy. I won't go into all the details, but there's one of them who's Duryodhana. And Duryodhana, when he was born, all the signs were inauspicious. Jackals were howling, and the sun was eclipsed, and there were meteors falling and setting fire to everything. And everything was going backwards, and et cetera, and et cetera. So everybody who had eyes to see knew this guy was bad news. But his father, who is blind, is particularly attached to Duryodhana, even though he knows Duryodhana is wicked, but he doesn't want to see that. And so Duryodhana grows up, and he's very strong and very skilled and everything, but he's quite wicked. And he always has enmity for his half-brothers or cousins, however you figure it, the Pandavas. So the Pandavas are these 5 brothers. And in our version, there's only 2 of them that we really, really want to talk about. I mean, in the larger context, we would want to talk about all of them, but there's really 2 of them that we want to talk about. The oldest, who's Yudhishthira, he's the king. And the middle one, who is Arjuna, and Arjuna is the main warrior. And so Duryodhana always has enmity for the Pandavas, and right from the get-go, he's set on killing them. So he's tried all various means. He's tried to burn them to death. He's tried to poison them to death. All kinds of deceit and trickery, all kinds of ways. And finally, nothing worked quite. And finally, he hatches a plan, which is that he's going to trick them. He's going to play a game of dice with them that's done deceitfully. So the dice are loaded, basically. But there's this code of honor. Okay, so even though this game of dice, everybody knows it's not good to play, but the code of honor is that if one member of royalty invites another member of royalty to do something, then the one who's invited has to say yes. And so Duryodhana invites Yudhishthira to play dice, and Yudhishthira knows that this is, everybody knows this is a cricket deal, but code of honor dictates that he must say yes. So he says, sure. And through trickery, Duryodhana gets everything from Yudhishthira. Everything. The whole kingdom, and his own brothers, and Yudhishthira's own life, and their wife. They're all married to one woman. Not the 5 brothers are married to one woman. And so he gets everything in this cricket deal. And then finally, because that was determined to be maybe a bit extreme, they say, fine, we'll change the deal. We'll play again. And this time when we play, here's the way it's going to work. Whoever wins gets everything for 13 years. And then whoever loses for that amount of time has to go away out into the forest. And then for the 13th year, they have to be in disguise, and nobody has to be able to recognize them. If they're recognized in that 13th year, then they have to start over in another 13 years of exile. Of course, dice are loaded, so the Pandavas lose. So Pandavas are exiled. So they take this rather well. They follow through on it. They're exiled for 13 years, and they live the last year in hiding. Now, they're thinking, the Pandavas are thinking, okay, this is really difficult for us, but at the end of this, we're going to get everything back because that's the deal. And of course, they will be honored. So they do their exile, and then they come back and they say, okay, now we did our thing, the deal's up, give us everything back. And Duryodhana says, I won't give you anything, not anything, nothing at all. And so now they go to war. And now here's the point that I want to make about this. When they're about to go to war, the Pandavas have lots of doubts. They say, maybe it's really not that important, actually. We don't really need anything. We could just forget about it. We could just leave. We could go somewhere else. We could just go back to living in the forest, whatever. We don't need anything, actually. It's really not worth it. This war doesn't seem like a good deal. We'd be at war with our own family. Either we would die, or if we didn't die and we were victorious, then we would only have won by killing our own family. So then what's the point? And then they make the argument with themselves to say, the whole point of having a kingdom is so that we can have family, our family can enjoy it. But if we have a kingdom by killing our family, then we've killed off the reason to have the kingdom in the first place. So it's a bad deal. We shouldn't do it. But they are allied with Krishna, and Krishna is Vishnu incarnate. And he says, no, you've got to go to war. You've got to do it. And now when this war is actually, the Kurus have maybe 1.5 times the size of the army that the Pandavas have. They have their army is not only larger, but it's significantly more skilled. They have better leadership. They have better resources. They have everything. So it's completely, the odds are stacked against the Pandavas significantly. I mean, this is not even remotely fair. So in order to win, which they do, if you call it winning, I suppose, then in order to win, they have to resort to a bit of bending the rules. Okay, so again, there's this idea of honor that's very important here. So it's not it's not a kind of no holds barred kind of conflict. It's not everybody just out to kill everybody else. There are rules, and so those rules are, you could think of it more like a ultra violent athletics event competition. Okay, so there are rules to how they engage with one another. It's supposed to be 1-to-1, and it's supposed to be fair fighting. And so there are rules about how that is. Well, in order for the Pandavas to win, they actually at multiple points have to bend the rules. And so once this is the whole thing is over and everybody's dead except for 12 people, and the Pandavas are victorious, now again, they say, well, we've just won, but this was absolutely not worth it, because just like we had predicted from the outset, we won. In order to win, we had to kill our own family. And so now what? What's the point of all of this? This is terrible. So then they have to go through this kind of period of reconciliation to reconcile within themselves how things are, and to come to what in the Mahabharata we're presented with is the correct understanding. So what is that correct understanding? The correct understanding is, remember, there's a context to all of this. So and that context we can understand is a divine context. It's not, if we're zoomed in on the earthly context, then there's no, it's all relative, and at that level, then we say, oh, as family, I don't want to kill them. I'll just go off into the forest. Who cares? I don't really care about the kingdom, actually. I don't care about all the injury and insult that's been done. It doesn't really matter. I turn the other cheek and all that. I don't really care. And at a human level, maybe that's true. But this story is meant to be provocative so that we can look at it in ways that are where it's operating at different levels, not just at the level that we think about it. Because it's maybe not the best guidebook for how to for our social interactions. Maybe not, I guess, but maybe not the best guidebook. But at other levels, perhaps it is, because remember, again, there's a divine context, not just an earthly context. But the divine context is that there are these two groups, the Devas and the Asuras. And the Devas, although not perfect, they're virtuous. There's an order to things. There's a sense of rightness and wrongness. There's a willingness there's a truthfulness, not perfect truthfulness necessarily, but there is truthfulness. And then the Asuras, although not evil per se, there's a sort of chaos. It's just might makes right. And that what is seen in the larger order, so the one who is dreaming and the thing that the creator who sprouts from his navel, actually have a preference. See, they're not totally neutral on this whole thing. They actually look at it and they say, I have a preference. I prefer this order and virtue. I want that to dominate in the balance of things. And so because of that preference, then that's how things are meant to be. This is the divine context to understand. And so this story that's taking place on Earth, as it were, is playing out that larger story so that we can maybe understand it at a human level, and it will make it more real for us so that we can start to contemplate it and benefit from that in our lives. So in our lives, as I said from the beginning, we have challenges. And when we have those challenges, one way that we can approach that, and sometimes it's a valid way, is that we can say, actually, I don't need to have this conflict. I can just avoid this conflict entirely. So there, that's turning the other cheek. So there are times in our lives when I'm sure that's appropriate and good, because if we just approached every conflict in the same way, and that same, if it was always the same way, no matter what that way is, then that wouldn't be very interesting at the very least. Probably not very good either. And especially if the only way that we ever approached conflict was just to fight, that would definitely not be very good, because we know what that would be like. That would be terrible. That would just be the Asura way. There's conflict, let's fight. I think I can win, let's fight. So that's, in our hearts, we know that that's not what we want. But if we then take this approach of, well, always turning the other cheek, maybe that's not actually right either, because if we do that, here's what happens. In the divine context, we could say then the Asuras dominate, and that the soul who is dreaming all of this actually has a preference. Don't you have a preference? I mean, to be alive, you have a preference. So the soul has a preference, and that preference, if we allow for the Asuras to dominate, then what we end up with is chaos, entropy. And so that preference isn't realized. The preference for order, for virtue, for what we feel is goodness, truth. And that doesn't have to be a universal thing. I'm not saying that there is a thing with a capital T. There might be, called truth, but I'm just saying the truth that you know in your heart, the truth of who you are, what is true for you, the truth of your soul. You have a preference for that by definition. And if you can avoid conflict, that is a way to deal with conflict, is to avoid it. But if the only thing that you do is avoid conflict, what happens is, well, the exact phrase that Duryodhana uses at so many points in this conflict, before it comes to war, so many people, everybody says to Duryodhana, you've got to make peace with the Pandavas. All of his advisors, everybody is telling him, well, other than a few people who are egging him on, but everybody else, they say, you've got to make peace with them. And the Pandavas, they even say, look, we had established this empire. We were, Yudhishthira, by his own strength and intelligence, had become emperor. Now he's willing to say, fine, you keep almost all of it. You Duryodhana can be the emperor. Just give us 5 villages. That's all we actually need. Just give us 5 villages. And Duryodhana his response is, I will not give you so much as you can pick up on the head of a pin. 5 villages? I won't give you 5 villages. I won't even give you a speck. So this is the thing that I think we're asked to see, is that we can avoid the conflict. But if we keep avoiding the conflict, we need to see who we're in conflict with, or what we're in conflict with. And what it is that we're in conflict with is by its nature, we don't have to have a judgment about it. We can just notice and tell the truth about it. By its nature, it is greedy. Duryodhana doesn't have need for everything. He can't use all of it. It's ridiculous. So it's not that he needs it. It's not that he'll use it. It's not that he even really actually could care. It's just that he's fundamentally greedy. And he is unable to be anything other than that. And so long as he is allowed and to get away with it, his response will be, I will not give you so much as a speck. Nothing will be yours. As far as I'm concerned, you do not even have anywhere to stand here. There's nowhere for you to be. I want you dead. That's his response. Because it's all mine, and I don't want you breathing my air. I don't want you standing on my ground. I don't want you taking up my space. So that is who we're in conflict with in certain instances. Maybe not in all. I'm not saying every conflict you have is like that, but certain conflicts are like that. And those conflicts, if we don't tell the truth about it, then what we're actually doing is we're condoning our own demise. We're participating in our own self-destruction. And this is the thing that is repeatedly that the Pandavas struggle with, particularly Yudhishthira. He really struggles with this because has a very strong sense of what's right, and violence is the last resort. And he looks at and judges the whole thing, and he says, look, there's no way to win in this. And in a narrow context, he's right. But in the divine context, looking at it in terms of what the desire of the soul is, he's mistaken. And that's why he has to be repeatedly educated by these divine characters, including Krishna, who's the incarnation of the soul, to guide him and to show him that there is something, there is a larger context, and that for this life to have any meaning at all, that desire of the soul has to be honored, because otherwise the every action that's being taken place by avoiding the conflict is actually enabling self-destruction. It's enabling that greed, which is seeking to consume everything, including this self, which will say there's no room here for you. You can't have any of this. And so when we have conflict, when we experience conflict in our life, it's maybe tempting, maybe tempting to think or believe that we have some sort of something figured out, that we've identified the correct strategy. You know, if we say, well, I've read the Bible, and Jesus advocates for turning the other cheek. I think that Gandhi was pretty smart. I'm with Gandhi, nonviolence. then we can fall into the trap of self-destruction, but dressed up as virtue. And that may be a mistake. So if we find, well, what are some ways to know if you're falling into this trap? If you're falling into this trap, then you will likely experience a particular kind of response or function of the nervous system. So there's the autonomic nervous system, as it's called, is said to have these two basic categories of function. One that's referred to as sympathetic, and the other, which is called parasympathetic. And oftentimes, sympathetic is referred to as the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is often referred to as the feed and rest, or something like that, which is a bit of an oversimplification, because the parasympathetic also is the domain of the freeze response. So certain types of organisms, certain types of animals are not able to they're not able to access, so they don't have fight or flight. That's not something that's evolved in them. And so the only thing that they have available to them is freeze. So when they experience a conflict, a threat, perceived threat, then what they do is they freeze. And so it's a physiological change in the nervous system, and their body switches to approximating death. And so in extreme cases, that they really are approximating death. And this is a last-ditch effort to survive. So if there's a perceived threat and there's no ability to avoid it, then the organism switches into this state so that maybe the threat will no longer be interested. So, for example, a possum and being approached by a jaguar. I don't know if they're jaguars and possums live in the same place, but let's say a possum and a panther. Also has a nice alliteration there, a possum and a panther. And so the possum can't escape from the panther. It doesn't really stand a chance. So the possum just goes into freeze, playing possum, as we say. And it's not playing, the possum's nervous system just switches over and approximates death. Now, because the possum seems to be possibly dead, the panther maybe ceases to be interested, unless the panther is extremely hungry. But the panther probably prefers that its prey is still alive. And so here is this thing that may be dead, and the panther says, nah, I'll go find something else to eat. And maybe the possum survives. So this is, it works for survival. The only problem with it is that it will actually sometimes kill the possum, because if you're playing dead, maybe sometimes you play too well and you actually die. And this can happen because it's not really playing, like I said. And furthermore, in humans, and possibly in other organisms, but in humans, if we are accustomed to this freeze response, if that's the way that we respond to our conflicts, then we cease to really feel very alive. We become somewhat habituated to this state in which we're not quite fully alive. And so there can be a sense of not quite fully alive, not dead, but not quite fully alive. Like perhaps you have a sense that there was, that you can recall being alive, and you know that you're not quite dead, but you don't feel quite alive. And I think that this can be the consequence of avoiding conflict, because if you keep avoiding conflict, bringing it back to the story, Duryodhana, your inner Duryodhana, has occupied the entire landscape and said, "This is mine. I'm the emperor, and there's no room here for you." So there's no room for you. There's no room for you to be. There's no room for you to breathe. There's no room for you to put your feet down. You can't really come down to earth. And so sometimes I'm proposing it can be helpful to reevaluate how it is that we respond to the conflicts of our lives. A lot of the time, I think that we have so successfully constructed a story for ourselves that justifies avoidance, that it may be largely invisible to us, actually, how much we avoid. And also, even when it's not invisible, we may have justified it so thoroughly that we may feel that there's no other way, because we've defined ourselves as being the person who avoids conflict. But we've dressed that up in a particular way, so that we perceive that that's virtuous. And then to deviate from that would be unvirtuous, and it would be a sort of death of this character who we've identified with, this so-called virtuous character. And that would be very terrifying and uncomfortable to us. And so a lot of times we just sort of avoid it, or we don't even notice that we have any options. We just kind of settle for feeling not fully alive. So we can have this discomfort. And sometimes the discomfort can be sometimes the discomfort is for, we could call it good reasons, like it's good feedback sometimes. Like maybe you would feel uncomfortable if you're putting yourself into a genuinely dangerous situation. And so that would be, we could call that positive feedback. To feel uncomfortable in a dangerous situation would be positive, because that helps you to realize, oh, this is a dangerous situation. Perhaps I don't want to put myself in this. Or at least I should be sure that I want to put myself in this situation. Is there a good reason for me to be in this situation? But on the other hand, sometimes we experience discomfort because we're afraid of dying to this character, this so-called virtuous character. And but it may actually be a prison that we've created for ourselves. And so differentiating between these kinds of discomforts is an important thing for us to be able to do. And the only way that it seems to me that we can do that is by being willing to be present in those situations, and rather than backing away as we may be accustomed doing, to actually stay there in the discomfort, fully conscious. And so there are probably many ways in which we are accustomed to, well, avoiding, first of all, but then even if we don't avoid, there may be many ways in which we are accustomed to numbing ourselves or going unconscious. And so I think that we've got these two unwanted habits that actually serve to empower self-destruction, that we can help ourselves with by choosing to not indulge them. And so just what I'm encouraging is be aware of these situations, and then where you feel uncomfortable, and then notice the habit of either avoiding or numbing, and choose not to indulge either. Choose to start to reframe discomfort for yourself instead of seeing discomfort, or even, well, I'll just call it discomfort for now. Instead of seeing discomfort as a problem, see discomfort as your ally. Discomfort is the ally, because discomfort is helping you to meet the experience in a new way that can help you to re-engage in your life in a positive way that is self-affirming rather than self-destructive. And the other thing here with it is a practical thing, is to get clear on what do you really want, and not from the level of your, we'll call it mind, because at the level of mind, you can have worked out any different number of things, and those may or may not be true or useful, because again, you could have justified any number of things, and many of which would actually be self-destructive. You could say, well, I don't really want anything. I don't really even care about anything. And that's probably not true, actually, because here you are, you're alive, actually, you're incarnated. And so the fact that you exist here is really proof positive of a desire. That's, we could say, what this is. This is a manifestation of a desire. And if you aren't willing to follow through on it, then by definition, you're engaging in self-destruction. If you're having judgment that you shouldn't exist, which is basically what an unwillingness to confront any conflict is, then, because then you're unwilling to assert yourself and stand your ground and say, I am taking up space. I'm going to take up space. This is my village. I'm not going to give it up to you, Duryodhana, who won't give me anything. I'm going to occupy this. I'm going to stand my ground because I have a right to exist. And so, to look to see what you want, and again, not at the level of mind, which can justify anything, but at the level of the soul. So, and when I'm saying that, what I mean is, if we think back to the way that I presented the whole cosmology, the context for the story, I said, and this is, of course, my telling of it, but I presented it that within Shiva, this unfathomable emptiness and fullness, there's a desire. And that desire is what gives rise to all of creation, beginning with the soul, this character Vishnu, who's asleep, the ocean of milk, dreaming, all of this. So the soul is, it is the desire. It is the manifestation of that desire. It has a form, a subtle form, but a form nonetheless. So you have a soul. You are a soul. This whole the soul is more real than all of the rest of it. In some sense, we could say. Not to say that the rest of this is not real, but I'm just saying that the soul is more primary. And I'm making this point because a lot of the time we forget about that. So I'm not trying to diminish the value of the material or the more substantial or denser aspects of existence, but I am saying that if we overlook the soul, which we often do, then we're disconnecting and imagining a false separation in which then all of this is just a drift, meaningless. It's all relative. Who cares? It doesn't mean anything. But only if we overlook the soul. But if we acknowledge the soul and we recognize that the soul, I am a soul, and this soul already, it already has a subtle form. It already is a desire. It is a desire. It is a desire to know itself, to express itself. So this soul that you are has a right to exist, and that that you, as you're at the level of mind, if you try to negate it, you're just in some sense, you're just prolonging the suffering, because this soul wants to express. It does have a right to exist, and it must express. And so and this I believe is shown in the Mahabharata, because here the Pandavas have their doubts, but Krishna being the soul says, you must. And again, if we look at the larger context, the divine context, see that there are these two, call them forces. And they're the one, it's not that we don't have to say that one is good and one is bad. I mean, that's a simplistic way of putting it, but we could see that one is more truthful, meaning more truthfully in expression, more pleasing to the soul. The soul looks at this and says, this is more of what's true. This is more of what I desire. And then this other force, the soul looks at it and it says, not so much. But this other force has more strength, more numbers, there's more there, more. And if we don't choose what it is that's true, then this other thing dominates. But that is painful because it's not true. We could just look at it that simply and just say it's not true. It can't negate the soul, because the soul is fundamental. All of this is existing in the soul. And so, but what it can do is it can dominate in the experience. And when it dominates in the experience because it's not true, there's a pain, because there's a misalignment, there's a desire, and then that desire is not being expressed. So choosing to avoid the conflict is giving power to that which is is dominating in conflict with what is true. And even though it may be very uncomfortable to stay with the conflict, to remain conscious and to get clear on what you want, what you as a soul want, that may be very, very uncomfortable, but it is actually, I guess I could say that's the purpose of your life. If you think about what is the purpose of this life, is it just for what? To get a bunch of stuff? Because all of that is clearly transient. You don't get to hold on to it, no matter how much you get. So it can't be about that. But that, just because it's not about the acquisition of stuff, doesn't mean then that it's true that acquisition of stuff is problematic or should be avoided, because it may be that acquisition of stuff selectively could be congruent with what is true. It's going to depend on you. You can't say that anything's true across the board for everybody, but for you to know yourself then reveals what is true in terms of self-expression. And as usual, a lot of words to say something simple, which is be yourself. It's why you're here. And in order to be yourself, you have to be willing to you have to be willing to know yourself, which you can't, if you wait to have it, to know yourself before you're willing to take action, then I think you miss the boat. Because it seems to me that to know yourself takes place through action. And that means conflict. You know, in order to know yourself, it's known in contrast with what you're not. Or to know what's true is to know that in contrast with what's not true. And that's only going to come about through conflict. So if we say that conflict is a bad word and we have to avoid it, then we actually miss out on the very thing that allows us to know ourselves so that we can experience the true satisfaction, which results from being fulfilling the purpose of this life. So another way of saying this is that, strangely, the purpose of your life is to consciously engage with the conflict. Or the purpose of your life is to be awake to the discomfort. And rather than framing it as discomfort is bad and must be avoided, and thereby the purpose of my life, even though I don't know exactly what it is must involve avoiding conflict and discomfort, we could start to see that that is a misunderstanding. It's not actually true, because when we take that to be true, what the result of that is that we lose everything. We lose everything possible, to the point where we have nowhere to stand, no air to breathe, no life left to live. And although we may be alive in theory, in practice, we're not. And so we are called to, and I think, and I'm saying this, it will be more or less true for individuals, but I think it's broadly true for people today. And it's probably been broadly true for people for a very long time, if not forever, but probably particularly true today. And so if avoiding conflict and discomfort is an error, what I'm proposing, again, I've already said this, is that to consciously engage with the conflict and discomfort is not, it is the fulfillment and the purpose, but by doing that, it reveals itself in a way that we cannot understand prior to being willing to engage with it in that way. What I mean is that if all I could say about it is the purpose of your life is to engage with discomfort, that sounds miserable. And then you say, well, what's the point of life? That's terrible. But what I'm actually getting at is that it only seems terrible because of the way that we've framed it. And actually, it turns out to be fulfilling in ways that can't be understood prior to that engagement. So practically speaking, how does one go about that? And I suppose there are probably infinite ways, but in broad strokes, notice, I mean, awareness is key. So you have to be aware of what's going on. So just start to notice how you attempt to avoid conflict. Notice the discomfort that you're trying to avoid. And notice how you try to numb yourself. And then I would say that's just a good starting point. Just notice. That knowledge it's a prerequisite for anything further. And in many ways, that will be a guide. If you just continue to investigate that will guide you along the way. Maybe there are more or less skillful ways to approach it, other details that can be said about it, but not today, right? Not now, for a variety of reasons. One, because we're at time, and for another, because I'm not really I haven't thought through that to try to come up with a kind of framework or list of those things at this point. But that would be the starting point, at least, would just be to notice, how am I, here I am, here's some conflict, I feel uncomfortable. My habit is to try to avoid it. And just to see that and learn about all of your various strategies for how you do that. I mean, it's simple. It's relatively simple to say those words, but the actual practice of it is very rich and subtle. And so it requires it requires investing yourself into it, committing to it, seeing it through. It's not a one-day thing. It's not a 1 week thing. It's a lifetime thing, but it's a complete reorientation, and it can really make a huge difference. I know this to be true because I have, at multiple points in my life, I've experienced that, where I realized how I was making that mistake, and I started to investigate and reoriented myself and reconditioned and reframed everything so that I began to see things differently, respond to things differently, and have different experiences as a result. So that's it for now from me today. You must be pleased to know that. It's always nice when it finally comes to an end. But for those who would like to stay on for Q&A or hear live, I'm happy to do that as well. But let me end this recording.